In the previous lesson, we created a class that encapsulates all of the functionality of interacting with our file, and it did require extra work. However, we have a more flexible and robust application, and unfortunately, that's just the trade-off. If you want a flexible application, you have to put the work in and write the extra code. But let's briefly talk about what we have now that we have a file data provider. Well, one thing is that if we ever decide to use multiple files within the application, all we have to do is just create another file data provider object and then have it look at whatever file we need it to. And now we have two objects that interact with our data in the same way, and we didn't have to write any new functions or anything like that. And that's the beauty of object-oriented programming. We are able to reuse functionality as often as we need to. But something else, and this is what our ultimate goal is. We want to move our data store into a database. And it would be really nice if all we had to do was this. Change the name of our data provider so that we would use a MySQL data provider that looks at a database and interacts with it in order to get, update, and delete our information. And we will eventually get there. However, we will need to make a few changes because our data structure is going to change when we get there. But that's in the future. We don't need to worry about that. But this is the goal, so that all we have to do is just swap out whatever data provider that we are going to work with, and our application would still work without any other modification. Well, in this lesson, I want to add a little bit more flexibility. I want to use what's called a data abstraction layer. Basically, the idea is that we abstract all of the functionality for interacting with a database so that we don't directly use our data object. Instead, we would use a class, and it's a special type of class called a static class, so that it would look like this. We have data, and then we would search and pass in the information that we wanted to search. That way, this data class that we would be using would be responsible for working with our data provider, and the rest of the application doesn't care how it works. It just knows that this data class is going to provide that functionality. Now, I use the term static class very loosely because in PHP we don't really have static classes. We can define a class that has what are called static members. Now, as far as terminology is concerned, a member is just a property or a method. That's just how we group those things together. It's a lot easier to say members as opposed to properties and methods. So, what then does it mean to be a static method or a static property? Well, let's look at our file data provider. So whenever we create a file data provider, we give it the file path, and then we save that as a property. Now that property belongs to the object that we create. So whenever we create a file data provider object, all of these methods, all of the properties belong to that object. And once we create an object, they are unique to that object. So for example, this data object that we've created is unique. It works with its own unique set of information. Now, a static property or a static method belongs to the class. It does not belong to any object. Instead, it belongs to the class. So whenever you use a static property or a static method, the syntax is different. If you notice, whenever I wrote this code, we used the name of a class followed by 2 colons and then the name of the property or the method. So the syntax itself is kind of alluding to the fact that search term is part of the data class as opposed to being part of an object. So let's write this data class, or at least let's start to do so. Let's create a new file inside of data, and we'll call this data.class.php. And it's going to start off normally. We will have class data, and then our curly braces. But a static class doesn't have a constructor because we aren't creating objects with this class. Instead, we just define the static properties or the static methods that we need. So let's start with the get terms. We're going to use the keyword static followed by public and then function, and then the name of this method, getTerms. And this is going to do nothing more than use our data provider's getTerms method. But then how do we get a data provider in here to work with? With our file data provider, we provided data that the class needs through the constructor, such as the file path. Well, since we don't have constructor, we aren't going to be able to use a constructor to get data into this class. Instead, what we could do is just write another method. In fact, let's make this the first method. And we'll call this initialize, so that we will initialize our data class with a data provider. And then we will store this in a static property so that we can access it throughout the class here. Now, as we are inside of the class, we don't really use the name of the class in order to access a static method or property. Instead, we use self. Now, I've always found this interesting because if we refer to an object, we use this, which has a $sign, whereas with a static class, we don't. We use just the word self. Just something else as far as the syntax is concerned that alludes to the fact that we are interacting with a class itself as opposed to an object. But then after self, it's the same syntax. We have 2 colons, and then we have the variable or the property that we want to interact with. In this case, we're just going to call it DS, short for data store, and then we will set that to data provider. Now, one thing I do want to do is go ahead and just define this before we assign it, and we will do that outside of any method here. So we will make this private because it doesn't need to be accessible from outside. That's why we have this data class, so that it is going to work with the data store as opposed to anything else. So now inside of getTerms, all we have to do is just return the result of calling our data store's getTerms method. So it's going to look like that we are going to have a lot of repetition, and kind of in a way, yes, we do. But the idea is that our data class is wrapping around our data store or our data provider so that we don't have to worry about working with the data provider directly. And I just pasted in the code because once you do it once, it's the same thing all the way down. So now that we have this data class, the first thing that we need to do is make it accessible throughout our application. And the app file is really the central part of our application. So let's just copy that line. We want to include data.class.php. And now we will initialize our data class, and we will provide it the file data provider. So we're just going to call the constructor, passing in the result of calling that constructor. And there we go. And I like this particular approach because, first of all, we now have this data class that we use to separate our application from our data providers. But we have also protected our data providers, because let's look at where we have first created that file data provider. We assigned it to a variable. Well, a variable is just a variable. Somewhere down the line, we could mistakenly set it to something else, and that's going to break our application. And there's really no way to make this a constant like we did inside of config. It would be great if we could come in here and we could use the constant like this. But we can't, because we can't have objects in a constant. That's just a limitation of PHP. So we have separated the application, or the main application code, I should say, from our data providers. And we've also protected it, because now we can't just come in here and erase or change the value of our data provider, because it is now protected inside of this data class. So all we have to do now is just use the data class everywhere that we need to. So all we have to do then is just copy this data : and since all of the method names are the same, we'll just paste in data class. So that was index. Let's look at detail. Here we'll just paste in the data class. And I think that that's good to go. Now, the admin is going to require a little bit of extra work here, but for the most part, it's going to be relatively simple. We'll just add in data anywhere that we are interacting with our data store. So here we are getting the term so that we can later edit that. So we want to update term there. We'll go to delete, which is kind of the same thing. We get the data, and then for a post request, we delete the data. And then for create, all that we need is right here, add term. And I think everything else should work just fine. So if we refresh this page, everything is going to work. Let me make sure everything is saved. Yes, it looks like it. We can close all the files, and that will tell us, yes, everything is saved. So we can easily view our information. If we go to the admin, we will need to log in. But after we have logged in, we should be able to edit any one of these. Let's edit XML. Let's delete XML, and let's create a new term. This will be JS2. We don't really care because we just are testing the functionality. So everything still works as it did before, but our application code is much more flexible now that we have a data abstraction layer.